I've moved to the sales worksheet in my workbook, and I want to familiarize you with what we have here. It's not large. It has about 51 fairly simple or straightforward sales records. We know that someone received an invoice, and there are first and last names for the customer. They placed an order on a certain date and activated their purchase on a certain date. Then we have different types of customers, including private, corporate, and government. The software licenses they were buying had to do with Office Home and Business, Professional, and Professional Plus. There is a calculation of how many days it took from the time they ordered to when they activated, the name of their sales rep, and of course the total order amount. While all of this is very useful, it does get cumbersome if it's anything more than these 50 records. Excel has had two consistent and powerful tools for simplifying and summarizing data, chart and pivot tables. Excel 2007 modified the processes we use to create pivot tables, and for Office is adding another tool that lets us quickly and visually filter pivot table data. In order to show you this, I've already created the pivot table. It's on the last worksheet called Sales Pivot. This takes all of the data from the sales sheet and breaks it down into a pivot table, showing a few things on the left side and just one along the top. Along the top is where we see the type of customers, corporate, government, and private. There is also one record that has everything blank. Along the left-hand side, going down column A, we have two different categories. The type of software license, that's Home and Business Pro and Pro Plus, and the names of our sales reps. So here we're able to very quickly see for each type of license which rep sold how much in sales to what type of customers. That's what a pivot table does. It answers some type of a question. In this case, instead of having to look at all 51 of those records, we can much more easily see exactly what we're looking for. Now, the second thing about pivot tables has always been that we can pivot or filter the information. We've already done the pivoting part. Let's talk about filters. If I go to cell A4, which is the drop-down for my row labels, I see that this is for license type and that I could filter between all of these different things. That's not new, but what I wanted to do was to filter for just Susan, who's one of my sales reps. I'll press Escape to get out of that. In order to filter for Susan, I have to do a few things. First, I have to activate the correct field. In order to do that, I have to click somewhere on the field, then go back to the same drop-down. Then I could come down and deselect all, and then scroll down, say I want Susan, and then say OK. Did that sound tedious? It was supposed to, because it is tedious. That's not a bad feature, and it is something we want to do, but that was too many clicks. Not only that, but someone who doesn't understand pivot tables will have a hard time figuring out what they have to do. Even though I'll show you a better way to do all of that, I want to point out one of the new enhancements for Office. Let's go back to this drop-down for the filter. It isn't obvious to a lot of people unless I point out the fact that we not only have the ability to sort, which we had last time, and the ability to use checkboxes, but now they have given us a search field. This is brand new, and it's built in to all of the filters for tables, pivot tables, and pivot charts. So when you're working with larger data sets, you don't have to scroll up and down just to find the little boxes you want and immediately remove or add the checkboxes. I'm sure you can imagine how cumbersome that could become. When you type a value into the search field, you can type the exact value or part of the value, and you can even use wildcards like the asterisk or the question mark. I'll look for something. I'll start typing an M, which is very short. We have only one entry, but you can see that you also have several variations in what you can do with this. With one check mark, I can choose to select all of the search results. In this case, it would be everything that started with M. If I were more specific, it would be everything that matched the criteria. I can also add this search to the current selection. So I can build things like a query builder, where I want this, and this, and this. There are a lot of different things you can do with this. It might seem very simplistic at first, but when you're working with very large data sets, this search capability within the filters is a phenomenal tool for making our work a lot easier and faster and preventing a lot of clicking on little checkboxes. Now I'll show you the next feature. I'll press Escape to get out of my filter and then go up to the Contextual tab for my pivot table tools. In order to do that, I need to move to the upper right-hand edge of the ribbon and go to the Pivot Table Options tab. Now, all of this isn't new, but if you haven't used Pivot Table since 2007, you'll discover that the entire way we work with them is different, even though the concept remains the same. My cursor is currently in the Pivot Table. I've gone to the Options tab, and now I want to use this new feature that I've been telling you so much about. This is something called a slicer, and it's basically what it sounds like. It lets us slice the data. Let me show you. I'll click on Insert Slicer and then click on Insert Slicer, and that brings up the equivalent of a field list. I simply place a check mark next to each of the fields that I want to quickly filter by. So for this particular one, it's definitely sales reps, because I want to find Susan and Mark and those other people very quickly. I also probably want to be able to filter by license type. Then I say OK, and here's where you see the magic. Individual windows are created for each of the fields I selected. I'll move these over so we can see them separately. One for license type, one for sales rep. If you look very carefully, you'll see that license type has most of them shaded, but the one at the bottom is a lighter shade. On sales rep, on the other hand, only Susan is highlighted. George is almost grayed out, and the three at the top, Beth, John, and Mark, are there but not shaded. This is because slicers visibly show us what is being filtered in the pivot table. So for license type, we're currently showing everything, except there's nothing to show for blank, and that's why that one's at the bottom and is grayed out. For sales rep, we do have sales for Beth, John, Mark, and Susan. We don't have any for George, so George is at the bottom. Currently, Susan is the one that's highlighted because she is the active filter. Do you see how easy it is? Instead of having to go through all kinds of things or know your data in depth, you can easily tell exactly what is being shown in the table as compared to what's available in the table. This already is a great start, and we haven't really even used them yet. Now let's learn how to use them. This is the easy part, and I'm sure you know how to do it because you know how to click, how to do click, shift, click, and how to do click, control, click. By that, I just mean selection. So if I wanted to see only things for Beth, I can simply click on Beth, and it is immediately filtered for Beth. If I wanted to choose two people that were not right next to each other, I could click on one like Beth, hold my Control key on the keyboard, and click on Mark. If I want to select a range of people, for example, John through Susan, then I do click, shift, click on John, hold the Shift key, click on Susan, let go of everything. These are really just standard universal selection techniques, clicking or clicking in combination with the Shift or Control key. I can do this for any one of them. So, only show me Professional Plus licenses that were sold by John. Now, it may be that your pivot table doesn't have any data, but it was very easy to find out what the data was. Let me go back here, Home and Business, and let's do Home and Business for Beth. I've worked with pivot tables for a long time, and this is a lot more intuitive and easier than working with the in-cell filters. What happens if we want to get rid of the filter? Well, we can either select all of the buttons in the list by doing a click, shift, click, or we can move to the upper right corner of the slicer and click the Clear Filter button. I'll do that for both. In this case, they'd both be about the same, but remember, if we had hundreds of entries for a field value, then the button would be much faster than scrolling from the top to the bottom of the list just to make the selection. So far, so good. They're easy to enable and easy to use. But, of course, it's more fun to adjust things. So, when you have a slicer selected, you can actually configure it. I'll configure the one for license type. Make sure I have that selected, and then you'll see that we have in Options Contextual tab. I can change the name of the slicer, which would be useful if you're pulling this from a database and the actual field name doesn't make sense to people. Now you can put in a more grammatically correct logical name. You can also adjust slicer settings. It tells us what the name is. It tells us if we even want to see the header. We can put in a caption, and we can work with things like how the buttons on the slicer are sorted, whether they're ascending, descending, or based on a custom list. You can also choose if you want to visually indicate items with no data and whether they should be shown last. And we're already seeing that. If I move this box over, that's why we're seeing things like George at the bottom with different shading. They're shaded differently because of the first check mark. They're placed at the bottom of the list because they don't have any data. Now, why would you ever want to turn that off? Because sometimes people want to see things in chronological or alphabetical order, even if there's no data associated with it. So, it's just an option. Now I'll cancel out of that. Of course, it wouldn't be a new version of Office if we didn't have the ability to stylize our slicers. I don't spend a lot of time doing this, but you certainly could. We can change the colors. Maybe color coding will help people to see that they are different and not get confused on which one they're clicking on. There's a variety of reasons you could do this. You can also work with a variety of arrangements, which isn't usually an issue, but over towards the right-hand side, you can also work with buttons. For example, if I want to see it wide rather than long, I could have there be 2 or 3 buttons across to optimize. This again will depend on how much data you have and how many buttons there are. We can also change the width and height. Now, speaking of all of that, we can do that with the actual slicer itself, but don't forget that this is really just a window, so all of my usual tools work. I can move to a corner. I can drag it to make it larger and smaller. All of the things I'm used to doing, including changing the vertical size. If I want to get rid of the slicer, that is also very easy. I click on it and press the delete key. Remember that we can also right-click on slicers to get a lot of these different options as well. Now I'll make one last adjustment with my slicer. I'll choose the Home and Business category because I want to remind you that even though this is a new way to filter, it doesn't replace the filter. If I move over to my Row Labels filter and click on the drop-down, I see that we're working with their sales reps. So, there again is that kind of irritating thing we have to remember when you press Escape. Let me go back to the level that I want to see by clicking on Home and Business. And now, if I go back to that drop-down, I can see that even though I've done this with the slicer, it's exactly the same as coming in here and working with the checkboxes in the old way. So it still accommodates the way people are used to working with it, but it certainly makes it more intuitive, easier, and faster for people who like the new way or don't know the old way. Yes, I do know that we could also adjust the field being filtered on, right from the in-cell filter where it says Select Field. However, my point here is that even with that feature, slicers are still easier and faster. Now I'll cancel out of that filter and finish by saying that segmenting data has never been easier. Slicers don't give us necessarily new functionality. You know, a lot of things in for Office are brand new, and a lot of things are enhanced. Well, this is somewhere between the two. It's not new functionality, because we've been able to filter for a long time, but slicers bring the functionality to the forefront, making it more visible and intuitive, and certainly more efficient to filter data than ever before. Now we can spend more time analyzing the data and making the choices based on the data rather than simply formatting the data and the pivot table itself.